The old woman left the paralyzed old man in the forest. But what the wolf did shocked everyone. The wheels of the cart bumped over roots, digging into the soft forest soil. Each jolt sent a dull, aching pain through Yefim's body, pain that seemed to come not from his paralyzed limbs, but from his very heart. He lay on old, musty-smelling hay, staring up at patches of clouds drifting through the pine canopy. The air was thick, filled with the scent of needles, damp moss, and something else, something wild and foreboding. Marfa walked ahead, hunched over, her strong, calloused hands gripping the shafts tightly. She didn't turn around, didn't say a word, and that silence was more terrifying than any scolding. Yefim remembered her differently, remembered how, many years ago, her laughter had echoed through this very forest as they gathered mushrooms in their youth. He remembered the warmth of her hand in his, back when he was still a strong, capable carpenter leading her to admire the log cabin he had built. Where had it all gone? The stroke had split his life in two, before and after. Before was the scent of shavings in the workshop, the excited bark of a dog at dawn, the respectful murmur of voices at the village gathering. After was humiliating helplessness, the stench of urine and bedsores, and the gaze of his wife, full of deep, festering hatred. He tried to speak, to make some sound, to ask where they were going, but only a strangled wheeze escaped his throat. Marfa flinched as if struck and stopped. The cart came to a halt under the deep shade of a sprawling old oak whose branches reached toward the sky like bony fingers. The woman walked around the cart and looked into her husband's face. There was no pity or hesitation in her eyes, only a scorched desert of exhaustion and resentment. She grabbed the side of the cart and forcefully tipped it over. Yefim tumbled heavily to the ground, his shoulder striking a protruding root. Pain shot through him, but he couldn't even cry out. He lay on his side like a discarded sack, looking up at her. Marfa dusted off her hands, adjusted her headscarf, and said, without looking at him, words as cold and sharp as shards of ice, "This is where you'll die, old fool. I'm tired of cleaning up after you." She turned and walked away without a glance back. Her figure quickly dissolved into the green gloom of the forest. Yefim was left alone. He listened to the fading creak of the cart, then the chirping of a bird, and then a crushing silence, broken only by the blood pounding in his ears and the desperate, soundless scream of his soul. He stared into the void where she had gone, and in his still clear, living eyes, two questions froze: why and for what? But there was no answer. Only the forest, indifferent and eternal, ready to embrace him in its cold arms. In that night's silence, under the canopy of the old oak tree, the helpless man, for the first time in many long months, felt not fear or loneliness, but a strange, nearly forgotten feeling of protection. With the first rays of dawn, timid and cold, Yefim awoke from oblivion. The night had passed in a strange half-sleep. At times he sank into a heavy slumber filled with fragments of the past. At times he came to, feeling the warm, living body beside him. The wolf had not left. He was still lying there, curled up in a ball. His steady breathing was the only sound breaking the morning silence. The old man felt a torturous thirst. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. He tried to swallow, but there was a lump in his throat. The wolf, as if sensing his suffering, lifted his head and looked at him with piercing yellow eyes. Then he stood, stretched his powerful body, and gently nudged Yefim's cheek with his wet nose. The old man let out a faint groan. The wolf nudged him again, more insistently, then took a few steps to the side and turned back to look at him. His gaze was meaningful and demanding. He came back, nudged Yefim once more with his muzzle, and again stepped away, indicating a direction. Yefim understood there must be a stream down in the lowland. He remembered it. The wolf was showing him where the water was. But how could he get there? He couldn't move. The beast, seeing the man wasn't moving, came close, pressed against his back, and began to push. Slowly, inch by inch, he moved the helpless body across the damp ground, over moss and last year's leaves. It was a titanic effort. Yefim felt the wolf's muscles straining, his paws digging into the earth. He couldn't help, he could only not resist. After several agonizing minutes, they reached the goal, a slope leading to a ravine where water gurgled below. The wolf went down, scooped a mouthful of water, returned, and let the droplets fall directly onto Yefim's cracked lips. It wasn't enough. So the beast went back down again and began digging at the earth with his paws at the water's edge, forming a small puddle. Then he nudged the old man again until Yefim's head was directly over this tiny source. With his last strength, Yefim lowered his head and drank the cool, clean water. He drank long and greedily, feeling life return to his dried-up body. When he finished, he collapsed weakly to the ground. The wolf sat nearby, watching him, breathing heavily. He had saved him from thirst, but now hunger began to make itself known. His empty stomach twisted in spasms. Yefim thought the wolf would now go hunting, but after a short rest, the wolf rose again and disappeared into the forest thicket. The old man thought he had gone for good. Gratitude and a new, bitter sense of loneliness battled inside him. But half an hour later, the wolf returned. In his teeth, he wasn't carrying a bloody piece of meat, but something else. He approached and carefully placed a few wild, shriveled forest apples near Yefim's head. He must have found an old abandoned apple tree at the forest's edge. They were sour and hard, but to Yefim, they were a feast. He couldn't pick them up. But the wolf, understanding this, nudged one apple with his nose directly to the man's hand. Yefim's barely responsive fingers managed to close around the cold, smooth fruit. He brought it to his mouth and bit in. The sour juice filled his mouth, and it was the taste of life. The day dragged on slowly. The sun rose higher, its rays filtering through the leaves, painting intricate patterns on the forest floor. Yefim lay still, recovering from the trials of the night. The wolf never left his side. He lay nearby in the shade, but his keen eyes were constantly fixed on the man. He dozed, but his ears caught every rustle. By noon, the forest had filled with its usual daytime sounds, birdsong, the buzz of insects, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Yefim felt as though his senses had sharpened, his perceptions deepened. He could hear the tapping of a woodpecker somewhere on an old pine, the squeak of a mouse in the roots of the oak beneath which he and his silent guardian lay. They had become part of the forest, one with it. Suddenly, the wolf raised his head, his ears stood up, and the fur on his neck bristled. He growled low and deep, staring into the dense forest. Yefim also felt a wave of anxiety. The air had changed, it grew heavier. There was a loud, careless snapping of branches, something large and powerful was pushing through the underbrush. A minute later, from behind the thick hazel bushes, it appeared, a bear, the master of the forest, a large brown male. He walked lazily, swaying from paw to paw, sniffing at the ground. His beady little eyes stopped on the motionless figure of the man. The bear froze, sniffing the air. The scent of blood, illness, and helplessness was a clear invitation to easy prey. He slowly began to move toward Yefim. The old man felt his insides go cold. He had no chance against such a beast. This was truly the end. He closed his eyes, not wanting to see the clawed paw fall upon him. But then came a furious, deafening roar. The grey wolf leapt to his feet and in one bound stood between Yefim and the bear. He was nearly half the size of the forest giant, but there was no trace of fear in his stance. He stood with his front legs spread wide, teeth bared, his whole body a tense knot of rage and courage. The bear stopped a few steps away, surprised by such boldness. He rose onto his hind legs, towering over the wolf, and let out a menacing roar that seemed to make the trees tremble. He expected the wolf to flee, leaving him the prey. But the grey one did not back down. He growled low and threateningly, his fiery eyes locked onto the bear. It was a duel of stares, a battle of wills. The old, solitary wolf had challenged the master of the taiga to defend a helpless human. The bear shifted from paw to paw, clearly unsure whether to attack. He wasn't so hungry as to risk a fight with such a desperate opponent. The risk of serious injury was too great. He roared again, more to intimidate than to threaten, then clumsily dropped to all fours, turned around, and crashed away into the forest, breaking bushes in his path. The wolf watched him go for a long time, tense, until the crackling of branches faded into the distance. Only then did he lower his head, shake himself off, and return to Yefim. He nudged the man's unmoving hand, as if checking if he was okay. Yefim opened his eyes. He had seen it all. He had witnessed that incredible battle of spirits. A wild animal, long thought by people to be a merciless killer, had just risked his life for him. The old man's eyes filled with tears, not of pain or despair, but of awe and gratitude. He couldn't lift his hand to stroke his savior, but he looked at him, and in that gaze was everything he could not say in words. And the wolf, it seemed, understood everything. He lay down again, resting his large head on his paws, and closed his eyes, though his ears remained alert. Meanwhile, in the village, the patron saint's feast was beginning. Since morning, smoke from ovens filled the air, the scent of pies spread. Women in festive scarves moved from house to house. The men gathered by the well, discussing the latest news. But Grigory, Yefim's neighbor, wasn't in the mood for celebration. Since early morning, an unease had gnawed at him. He hadn't seen Yefim for more than a day. Usually, in good weather, Marfa would wheel him out onto the porch, and the old man would sit there for hours, watching the street. Grigory always came by to exchange a few words. Yefim responded with difficulty, but his eyes always lit up with joy from conversation. But today, the porch was empty. Grigory approached their hut, the door was ajar. He knocked. Silence. He pushed the door and entered. The house was neat, too neat, lifelessly clean. On the table stood a jug of milk and a chunk of bread. Marfa sat on the bench, staring at a single point. Her expression was strange, detached, yet tense. "Hello, Marfa," said Grigory. "Where's Yefim?" "Haven't seen him around." Marfa slowly turned her head. Her face looked like a mask. "He's dead," she replied dully. "Passed in the night. May God rest his soul." Grigory's heart sank. "Dead? When? Why didn't you tell anyone? Someone could have helped. He should be buried properly." "I already did," she replied with the same flat tone, not blinking. "I buried him behind the garden. Didn't want to trouble anyone on a holiday. He lived quietly, and he left quietly. No need to disturb anyone." Grigory was stunned. There was something wrong, something false, in her words and her terrifying calm. To bury her husband behind the garden, like a dog, without a priest or people, Yefim, who was respected by the entire village, it was unthinkable. "Are you out of your mind, Marfa?" he frowned. "Behind the garden? Show me the grave." "There's nothing to see," she snapped, and for the first time, her voice carried sharpness. "I said I buried him, and that's that. Go celebrate, Grigory, and leave me to my grief." She turned away, making it clear the conversation was over. Grigory stepped outside, a cold dread creeping through him from a terrible suspicion. He walked around the house and looked behind the garden. The earth was untouched, no sign of a fresh grave. Then he remembered, last evening, as dusk was falling, he saw Marfa wheeling a cart toward the forest. He had wondered why she was going there so late, but hadn't thought much of it. Now, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into a horrifying picture. She hadn't buried him. She had wheeled him alive into the forest, to certain death. The thought made his hair stand on end. He ran to the men still gathered by the well. "Men, something's wrong," he shouted, barely catching his breath. "Yefim's gone. Marfa says he died, says she buried him behind the garden, but she's lying. I saw her take him into the forest last night, alive, in a cart." The men fell silent. Their cheerful faces turned serious. They exchanged glances. Everyone knew Marfa's harsh and bitter temper. Everyone knew how she treated her sick husband, and all realized that Grigory's words might be horribly true. "Into the forest," repeated Stepan, the burly blacksmith. "Alone? An old, sick man?" "Yes," confirmed Grigory. "She left him there, to be eaten by wolves. We must find him. He might still be alive." The festive mood in Mykolaiv vanished. In place of songs and laughter, a heavy silence settled over the village. Without a word, the men began returning to their homes for rifles, axes, and ropes. They weren't going to a celebration, they were setting out on a rescue. To find the man who might still be saved from a terrible fate. The forest greeted the search party with uneasy silence. About a dozen men, led by Grigory, moved in a line, carefully examining every thicket, every hollow. They called out, "Yefim! Uncle Yefim, answer us!" But only the echo answered them, hollow and distant between the ancient pine trunks. Grigory walked in front, his heart pounding with every step. He blamed himself for not stopping Marfa yesterday, not asking where she was going. Now, every lost minute could be fatal. They followed an old logging road, the same one Grigory believed Marfa had taken with her grim burden. The cart's tracks were faint in the dry soil, but his experienced eye could spot them. "This way," he said, pointing. She went deep into the forest, to the Devil's Ravine. The men exchanged grim looks. The place was wild and untouched. Wolves, of whom the village told terrifying tales, ruled here like rightful kings. The chances of finding Yefim alive were growing slim. They had searched the forest for over 2 hours, tension mounting. Someone began whispering that it was hopeless, that if Yefim had been there, even his bones were gone. But Grigory pressed on, refusing to believe that Yefim, who had taught him to set snares and read tracks, a man who seemed part of the forest itself, would die so dishonorably. Suddenly, one of the men, a young fellow named Fyodor, stopped and raised his hand. "Quiet, do you hear that?" Everyone froze and listened. Through the rustling leaves came a strange sound, a low, drawn-out growl. "A wolf," someone whispered. "Close." The men gripped their rifles and axes tighter. Grigory motioned for them to move forward, cautiously, silently. They crept toward the sound, step by careful step. The growling grew louder and more furious. After several more meters, they emerged into a small clearing where a mighty old oak stood, and what they saw made them freeze in stunned silence. On the ground, leaning against the roots of the oak, lay Yefim. He was pale and gaunt, but alive. His eyes were open, watching them. And beside him, shielding him with its body, stood a massive grey wolf. The beast bared its fangs in a grim snarl, eyes burning, fur bristling, ready for battle, ready to defend his charge to the last breath. The men were dumbstruck. The sight was so surreal it seemed like a dream, a man abandoned to die, and a wolf guarding him. What the hell? Stepan breathed. He's alive, Grigory whispered in disbelief. Alive. He took a step forward, but the wolf immediately stepped toward him, growl turning into a fierce bark. The men instinctively stepped back. No one dared move closer. They were at an impasse. There was Yefim, alive and only steps away, but a ferocious guardian barred the path. We'll have to shoot it, someone suggested from behind. Quiet, you fool. Grigory snapped. Can't you see? He's not attacking, he's protecting him. Then Yefim, mustering the last of his strength, barely parted his cracked lips. From his throat came a faint, hoarse whisper, but in the heavy silence, it sounded like thunder. My own, he looked at Grigory, and in his eyes were both a plea and a command. The wolf, hearing the man's voice, fell silent. He slowly lowered his head and looked at Yefim, then at the men. He didn't retreat, but the aggression in his posture faded. He seemed to be waiting. Grigory, realizing this was their chance, stepped forward slowly with empty hands outstretched. Another step. And another. The wolf watched every move but did not interfere. Grigory knelt beside Yefim. Uncle Yefim, you're alive. My God, you're alive, he touched the old man's hand. It was cold, but alive. The men behind them couldn't say a word. They looked from the emaciated old man to the enormous wolf sitting calmly beside him and couldn't grasp what they were seeing. How did he survive? Fyodor whispered. The wolf, Stepan answered, his voice filled with superstitious awe. He must have fed him. While a few men cautiously fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and jackets, Grigory sat next to Yefim, trying to give him water from a flask. The old man drank in small, greedy sips, and the spark of life slowly returned to his eyes. The wolf sat a few steps away, no longer aggressive, but not leaving. He watched everything with a kind of wise, detached attentiveness, as if evaluating the intentions of the people. His presence created an invisible barrier around the old man that no one dared to cross. When the stretcher was ready, Yefim was gently laid onto it. He groaned in pain, but even then, his eyes remained fixed on the wolf, as though he feared his rescuer might vanish. Seeing this, Grigory said quietly, he trusts the beast more than people. Don't worry, Uncle Yefim, we won't touch him. Let him follow us if he wants. And when the men lifted the stretcher, the wolf indeed stood up and followed, keeping a short distance. He didn't walk like a wild animal, but like a loyal dog escorting its master. The way back to the village felt endless. News travels faster than feet, and by the time the procession emerged from the woods, almost the entire village was waiting. Women gasped and crossed themselves at the sight of Yefim's gaunt face, and stared in horror and awe at the massive wolf walking behind. Marfa stood in the crowd. When she saw her husband alive, she turned as pale as linen. Fear flashed in her eyes, then raw panic. She realized she had been found out. Turning sharply, she tried to slip behind the hut, but her path was blocked by the burly blacksmith, Stepan. His face was darker than a storm cloud. "And where do you think you're going, murderer?" he growled, grabbing her shoulder with an iron grip. Marfa flailed like a trapped bird. "Let me go. It's none of your business." "Let go," I said. "He's ours now," Grigory interrupted, bringing the stretcher closer. "Look at what you've done, Marfa. You left him to die, and a wild beast found more humanity in him than you, his wife." The crowd buzzed like an angry hive. Curses and angry shouts rained down on Marfa. She was dragged into the middle of the street, surrounded by former neighbors whose faces now showed only contempt and rage. "What have you done, you monster?" one woman screamed. "Send her to Siberia." Under the hail of accusations and threats, Marfa broke down. She dropped to her knees, covered her face, and shook with silent sobs. Through the tears, she began muttering incoherently, pouring out all her pent-up hatred and exhaustion. "He wore me down. I had no strength left. Every day the same. No peace, no rest. I didn't want to. I just wanted it all to end." Her confession didn't earn sympathy, it only fueled the flames. The people didn't see a broken woman, they saw a traitor who had violated the most sacred law, the law of compassion. The judgment was swift and harsh, like village life itself. No one planned to hand her over to the authorities. The village had its own unwritten laws. "Leave," said the village elder, Grandpa Matvey, leaning on his cane. "Leave our village. And never let us see you again. Go wherever you want. No one will give you bread or water here. You're forbidden even to approach Yefim's house. Go, and let your sin go with you." Marfa was released. She rose from her knees, glanced around with hunted eyes, and hunched over, walked away down the road that led out of the village and into nowhere. No one looked after her. All eyes were on Yefim, now being carried into his home, and on the grey wolf who, having reached the porch, lay down as if he had always lived there. Yefim's hut filled with scents it hadn't known for many months, the bitter aroma of wormwood, the sweet fragrance of linden flowers, the tart smell of oak bark. It was Irina, the village healer, who tended to the old man. She had come as soon as he was brought in, silent, stern, with a canvas bag over her shoulder filled with medicinal herbs. Irina was a woman of few words, but her hands knew their work. She washed Yefim with warm decoctions, rubbed his immobile limbs with fragrant salves, and gave him a hot infusion that seemed to breathe a spark of warmth and life back into him. "His body is cold," she told Grigory, who never left his friend's bedside. Marfa's hatred chilled him, and the forest's fear finished the rest. "Now we must warm both body and soul." She worked slowly, with ritual-like focus, and the whole village helped. The women came in turns to stoke the stove, bring fresh broth and clean linens. The men chopped enough wood to last the winter. Yefim's suffering and his miraculous rescue united the people, reminding them they were one community, one family. And outside, on the porch, lay the grey wolf. In the first days, he frightened everyone. Children avoided Yefim's house, and women crossed themselves fearfully when passing. But the wolf showed no aggression. He didn't growl, didn't respond to barking dogs. He simply lay and waited. Sometimes, he would lift his head, listening to sounds from inside, as though monitoring his charge's condition through scent and the faintest rustles. Every day, Grigory brought him a bowl of food, sometimes leftover stew, sometimes bones. At first, the wolf didn't touch it, but eventually, realizing it was an offering, not a trap, he began to eat. Slowly, the village got used to their new and unusual resident. They stopped fearing him. People looked at him with superstitious respect, almost reverence. He was seen not just as a beast, but as some kind of higher messenger, a living embodiment of justice and loyalty. Children no longer feared playing nearby, and the men nodded to him in passing as to an equal. Weeks passed. Yefim slowly recovered. Arena continued her treatments, and the neighbors' care warmed him better than any fire. One morning, as Grigory changed his bandages, Yefim stared intensely at his left hand, lying on the blanket, limp and lifeless. He stared for a long time, focused, as if giving it a silent command. Then, suddenly, his fingers twitched slightly. Grigory froze. "Uncle Yefim, you moved." Yefim gathered all his will, and one finger, just one, slowly bent with immense effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his eyes shone with triumph. It was the first movement, the first step on a long road to healing. That evening, when word spread through the village, people gathered outside Yefim's hut. They spoke in hushed tones, but their voices carried joy. "He's getting better, our Yefim," they said. "It's the wolf." His wolfish loyalty pulled him back from the other side. Gave him his strength, no doubt about it. And looking at the gray beast dozing peacefully on the porch, no one doubted it. Time passed. Summer gave way to golden autumn, and then the first frosts. Life in the village went on as usual, but something had changed. A new legend had been born, told by the stove on long winter nights. The legend of old Yefim and his gray wolf. Each day was a small battle and a small victory for Yefim. After the first twitch came another. Then he could clench his hand into a fist. Arena never left him, bringing new decoctions and ointments daily. But his greatest medicine was his own will, fed by the silent support of his four-legged friend. The wolf now lived in the yard permanently. Grigory built him a large doghouse, insulated it with hay, but the wolf preferred sleeping on the open porch, even in frost, as if standing eternal guard. He had become Yefim's shadow. When they finally managed to seat the old man, the wolf approached the window and, rising on his hind legs, looked inside, meeting Yefim's gaze. In that silent exchange was more than any words could convey. It was a conversation between two souls bound by an invisible thread. By the beginning of winter, with Grigory's help, Yefim managed to take his first step. His legs were as weak as a child's, they trembled and buckled, but he stood. He stood on his own 2 feet. That day, it seemed the whole village held its breath. When Grigory led him onto the porch, Yefim, leaning on his neighbor's shoulder, took several steps on the creaking snow. The wolf immediately stood up and came to him, pressing his wet nose into Yefim's hand. Yefim lowered his trembling but now living hand onto the wolf's head and, for the first time in a long while, stroked the thick, coarse fur. "Thank you, my friend," he whispered, his first clear words since his illness. The wolf whined softly, as if understanding him. From that day on, they walked together every day. At first, just a few steps around the yard, then to the well, then to the village's edge. Yefim, leaning on the sturdy cane Grigory had carved for him, and the wolf walking faithfully beside him became a familiar part of the village landscape. The old man was learning to live again, and the wolf patiently accompanied him on that journey. He was Yefim's support, his protector, his silent companion. Sometimes Yefim would sit on a bench outside, and the wolf would rest his heavy head on his knees. The old man would run his fingers through the wolf's fur, gaze into the distance, and reflect. Perhaps he was remembering his past life, or perhaps he thought of that terrible night in the forest that, in a strange way, hadn't killed him, but instead gave him a second birth and the most loyal friend one could imagine. The village men, witnessing this, nodded with respect. They no longer saw Yefim as a feeble cripple. They saw a man who had walked through hell and returned. A man not broken by illness or betrayal. They saw the strength of spirit that surpassed physical weakness. Beside him stood living proof that compassion and loyalty know no bounds and are not determined by whether you are a man or a beast. A year passed, a long year filled with despair and hope and daily perseverance. Winter gave way to spring, spring to a scorching summer, and once again autumn painted the forest in crimson and gold. Yefim had changed beyond recognition. He still relied on a cane, but his gait was steady and confident. The gray in his beard seemed lighter, and in eyes that once held only pain and helplessness now shone calm wisdom and quiet joy. He could speak again, not as quickly as before, and his voice was hoarse, but it was strong. He had once again become the Yefim whom the village respected, a wise counselor people turned to for guidance. He could no longer work as a carpenter, but his hands could still craft simple toys for the village children or repair fishing gear. He sat on the porch of his hut, carving wood with a knife, and at his feet lay the gray wolf, always there. The beast too had aged over the year, more silver streaked his fur, and his movements had become slower and more measured. He was no longer a wild forest predator, he was a friend, a companion, a shadow. He followed Yefim everywhere, slept by his door, and watched him with steady eyes when he went inside. Their bond had grown so strong and so clear that no one could imagine one without the other. They were like two trunks of the same tree, fused at the roots. Sometimes they would go into the forest together, not to hunt, no, Yefim never touched a rifle again, but just to walk. The old man showed the wolf places where he had once set traps or built hunting lodges. He spoke to the wolf as if to a person, telling stories from his past life. And the wolf walked beside him, listening to his voice, breathing in familiar scents, and seemed to understand every word. It was their world, known only to the two of them, a world in which man and beast found in each other what others never could, unconditional loyalty and understanding without words. In the village, people said Yefim could now speak the language of animals and birds. And seeing the way he communicated with his wolf, they were ready to believe it. He had become a part of nature, just like his faithful companion. The story of his rescue had become a parable, one mothers told their children, a tale that the greatest evil can come from a human, and the greatest good from where it's least expected. Marfa's fate unfolded differently. Banished from the village, stripped of her home and support, she became a homeless wanderer. At first, she tried to find refuge in neighboring villages, but her vile reputation always arrived before her. The story of the wife who had left her ailing husband to be devoured by wolves had spread across the region. People shunned her as though she were plague-stricken. No one wanted to give her work or shelter. Her face, once merely stern, had grown gaunt and darkened from grief and hardship. The fire of spite that once burned in her eyes had gone out, now they held only fear and hunted exhaustion. She survived on charity, sleeping in abandoned barns and haystacks. Summer was bearable, but with the arrival of cold, her life became a daily struggle for survival. She grew wild, timid and silent, avoiding the people who had once been her world. The forest became her only refuge, the same forest where she had once left her husband to die. Now it became her home and her prison. She learned to find edible roots and berries. She learned to shelter from the weather. But the forest was not kind. It was full of danger. And every night she fell asleep in fear, listening to every rustle. One late autumn evening, as she wandered in search of food, she entered a clearing and froze. Blocking her path stood a pack of wolves, 6 or 7 full-grown predators. They stared at her with their yellow, unblinking eyes. Marfa froze, chilled with terror. She knew this was the end. She was weak, emaciated, and had nowhere to run. She simply stood there, awaiting the inevitable, eyes closed. But the wolves didn't move. They just stared. In their gaze, there was no hunger or aggression, only cold detachment, a sort of distant curiosity, as if they were looking at an empty space. The leader, a large, dark wolf, stepped forward, sniffed the air, turned his head, let out a low, guttural sound, and led the pack away. They passed her like a rock on the road and silently disappeared into the forest. Marfa opened her eyes. She was alone. They had not touched her. And in that moment, she understood the most terrifying truth: she had already been punished. Her loneliness, her banishment, her hollow, scorched soul, these were punishments more terrible than death. Even the wild predators sensed the emptiness in her and didn't want to stain their fangs on her. She was so broken and pitiful that not even a starving pack found her worth their attention. She collapsed to the ground and, for the first time in years, wept. But these were not tears of remorse, they were tears of hopelessness. She had been sentenced to a life worse than death. And the forest, witness to her crime and her punishment, kept her secret in silence.